Honourable Member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity today to recognize a former resident of Lunenburg County, Donica Patti. Canada's newest ambassador to Thailand is a graduate of Parkview Education class of 1980. Having received a Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies from St. Mary's University, Donica has spent time in China, Jordan and Cambodia working for Canada's Foreign Affairs and International Trade Department. In addition to being ambassador to Thailand, Donica is also the representative to the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Laos People's Democratic Republic. I'd like to extend my congratulations to Donica Patti for this incredible opportunity and wish her all the best as she represents Canadians in her ambassadorial role. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for member statements has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians have good reason not to trust this government with toll roads. Mr. Speaker, Freedom of Information request shows that the one toll road we already have, the Cobequid Pass, this government has decided to collect tolls for 8 years beyond that which is required to pay off the Cobequid Highway itself, Mr. Speaker. The Premier and his government have condemned motorists in Cumberland County to pay tolls for 8 years longer than necessary to pay for the road, and I will table that from the public accounts of the province. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, why did he decide to condemn Cumberland County motorists to pay tolls 8 years longer than necessary?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Transportation.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, thank the member for the question. That's certainly not the case. There's a number of different scenarios. As the member would know, in the life cycle and the payment schedule of the Cobequid Pass, there's a number of different components to that, in particular prepayments that were made, Mr. Speaker, over a number of time. As the member would also know, using that corridor, there's a significant amount of maintenance and work that has to be done to that year over year, including the repavement, which is happening at this point and has continued to happen over the next number of years. Mr. Speaker, those questions, those decisions are a long ways away, and there'll certainly be lots of public discussion about that. None of those decisions have been made, and we haven't strapped any extra payments or anything in particular to that Cobequid Pass at this point.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that is not the case at all. The only decision that's been made is to stick it to the drivers of Cumberland County for 8 years longer than necessary. The deal was that they would pay tolls until the debt for the road was paid off, and then those payments would cease. Because the toll revenue is higher than projected, the debt will be paid off in 2018, but this government decided to keep collecting tolls anyway till 2026, when they don't need it, Mr. Speaker. That's not fair. That wasn't the deal. No wonder Nova Scotians will never trust any Liberal government when it comes to toll roads. So I'd like to ask the Premier or the Minister, how can the motorists of Cumberland County trust this government when they're taking toll money that does not belong to them?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Premier. Mr. Speaker, this is the typical play by the Leader of the Opposition. This is fear-mongering on this particular decision. That's absolutely not the case. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of decisions that have to be made before 2018, before 2020, at specific intervals on this particular highway. There's a number of things that the government has done, previous governments, including ours, about how we would subsidize so there wouldn't have to be an increased toll on that highway, for example. There's a number of moving parts. That was done in the best interest of the motorists, particularly in the area that the member represents. Mr. Speaker, there'll be no trickery, there'll be no work under the table, there'll be nothing going on other than the best interest of the people of Nova Scotia, the people of the province, which includes that member's constituents, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, we'll do the right thing for the people of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it is typical of this Liberal government to collect more and more in taxes, more and more in tolls, when they told Nova Scotians that they would not. The Minister is trying to tell the people of Cumberland County that that money is for maintenance. It is not for maintenance, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's own briefing note, which I will table, makes clear that that toll money, which should be used to pay off the debt and free the people of Cumberland County of those tolls, is actually falling to the bottom line of the province. From his own notes, last year, $2.6 million million, not to debt, to the books of the province to make it look better. This year, $2.8 million, not for maintenance, but to make the books of the province look better. Will the minister apologize to the motorists of Cumberland County and put them back on schedule to get rid of those tolls when it was originally planned in 2018?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll apologize to the residents for their member playing politics on a very specific issue, Mr. Speaker. I truly hope that the representative, that the constituents that the members represent.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, it's not as simple. It's a very complex relationship. There's no trickery happening. There's nothing happening. They're going to keep screaming and yelling, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day,
order, please. Order, please.
That's all open and accountable, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, the member's obviously trying to play politics. It's nice to see all of a sudden on a couple weeks into the session he's so passionate about this issue, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, we are collecting tolls to pay the bondholders for this highway, Mr. Speaker. We're paying for maintenance. We're paying for increases and enhancement to the road. We're subsidizing so that the toll doesn't have to go up for those very residents, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, we'll do the right thing for Nova Scotians, not play politics with every single issue that comes through this place.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Yesterday, the Minister of Education said she is listening to teachers. Unfortunately, she forgot to tell the Nova Scotia Teachers Union. We just learned that the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education will not appoint a mediator to help with the ongoing negotiations with teachers. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier explain to the teachers, the parents and the students why the Minister is not appointing a mediator?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I first of all want to thank the Minister of Education for continuing to work with her partners in the Teachers Union. Mr. Speaker, and our partners across the province continue to respond to the classrooms across this province. I hope the honourable member would acknowledge the decision made by the Minister yesterday was in the best interest of teachers. We have said to them we'll continue to work with them. Looking forward to the partnership meeting tomorrow so that dialogue can continue. It is our hope, it is our wish, it is our goal that we continue to streamline what is being asked of teachers that has built up over decades. Mr. Speaker, there's no question, as I've heard from teachers across this province, their frustration just didn't happen in the last 12 months. This has been decades of building, and we have responded to them, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to respond to them, and I've been grateful from the teachers that I've heard who've been encouraged by the decision the Minister made yesterday.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 2 weeks since the teachers voted, and we are getting closer to the first provincial-wide teacher strike in the history of this province. It is how this government wants to be remembered? I don't think so. And as this government has drove teachers, will drive them into the street. Mr. Speaker, in order to listen to the teachers, you have to show up. Will the Premier agree to meet and get back to the bargaining table to negotiate with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said all along we continue to have conversation. I made it clear, though, that the parameters around the fiscal envelope is what they are. If I've said if the Teachers Union can find savings and want to bring back, we'll be happy to share those back with the members. Otherwise, like all public servants, the financial envelope is what it is.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier can talk all he wants about his record on education. The fact is that Nova Scotia Teachers Union has a strong strike mandate from their members. Teachers, parents and students agree on the issues about the classroom, and this government is refusing to take part in that discussion. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier admit that his heavy-handed approach is not working and it's time to return to a fair collective bargaining?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind him that two different executives, of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union accepted a deal. They brought back to the membership, who resoundingly said no. They gave the union a strike mandate. They will have to make the decision on what is next for them. We're going to continue to focus on the classroom across this province, going to continue to make sure we make those investments. We have made $65 million investments over the last 3 years, making up for the cuts that were done by the NDP government when they were in power. We're going to continue to listen to teachers to make sure that the classroom environment is improved. It is, Mr. Speaker, it is my goal, the goal of the minister, the goal of our government to continue to improve the classrooms across this province.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for EMO. Victims of the Thanksgiving Day flood continue to feel abandoned by the Liberal government. Families haven't received funding from the province Disaster Financial Assistance Program, and the department isn't sure when they will. Desperate homeowners have to rely on private donations through a fundraising website called GoFundMe to get by. And my question is to the Minister, will the government speed up this process so homeowners don't have to rely on the GoFundMe accounts to rebuild their lives?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, the province has been working very diligently and allocating additional resources to expedite this process. We understand how hard the situation is on families and on households. That's why we gave $500,000 that's being administered through Salvation Army for emergent needs. We've upped the cap that residents can receive for work on their houses or replacement from $80,000 to $200,000. We've eliminated the deduction the deduction on people's claims through the disaster relief program, Mr. Speaker. We have sent additional resources into the area to help process these claims. We are currently processing about 345 claims, Mr. Speaker, and the first check will actually be issued today to the members of Cape Breton.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, it's been a month since homeowners lost everything, and the government is now just starting to provide funds to these people. Thousands of dollars have been poured in with the GoFundMe, but this money is only starting now from the government. Why is this process taking so long, and when can the rest of the homeowners expect to hear back from the government?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is not accurate for the member to say the government has not sent funding in. In fact, in the first few days of this issue, we sent $500,000 to help with emergent needs, and we've heard back from many members of that community that have appreciated that. We are working very hard to expedite this process, get as much money out as quickly as we can. It is complicated, Mr. Speaker. I know that's frustrating, but we're dealing with people's insurance claims. People are still waiting to receive their letters from their insurance companies. Inspectors have to provide, the appraisals of the damage done. So it is a very complicated process. I want to assure the member we are expediting as quickly as possible. Additional resources have been sent, and I'm very happy to tell the member today that money is starting to flow.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week in public accounts, Deputy Minister of Health Peter Vaughan criticized the long-term care sector, saying it needed to modernize and stop being run in an ad hoc way. This is pretty rich, Mr. Speaker, coming from a government that has surprised the sector with funding cuts for two years in a row. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, how does the Minister expect long-term care facilities to modernize when the government continues to make ad hoc cuts to their budget year after year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question, and I can assure the member and all Nova Scotians that in no way did the Deputy Minister diminish the work that's going on in our nursing homes. We know that we have to modernize the approach, also that they use a more cooperative approach in terms of purchasing, using administrative collaboration as well to, in other words, to achieve efficiencies, and we needed to make changes, and this is part of the process.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also at public accounts, we heard from Janet Knox and Peter Vaughan, and they said that if seniors only spent 2 years in long-term care rather than the current average of 3 years, we wouldn't need to increase the number of beds in the province. We know that people want to live in their homes longer, but there is a time, Mr. Speaker, when it's no longer safe or appropriate. Healthcare decisions need to be based on patient needs, Mr. Speaker, not the needs of the system or the government's bottom line. So, Mr. Speaker, how does the minister expect long-term care facilities to meet the needs of more acute clients with such a shrinking budget they've seen over the last 2 years?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And just by changing the policy around entering a nursing home, we've been able to cut the wait list by over 50%. We're also now finally have an instrument whereby risk and need will be the determination for people entering a nursing home, and I think we'll see our wait list more appropriate for the care that our seniors will need at a different point in their lives.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Today, the Minister of Labour issued a statement where she concluded that she does not believe an external mediator can resolve the dispute between teachers and the government. Mr. Speaker, she's required to review all available information from both sides to reach that conclusion. Clearly, teachers who asked for mediation were prepared to make it work. That leaves the Premier as the culprit here, Mr. Speaker, so I will ask him, why did he say no to trying a mediated settlement?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We did not say no, Mr. Speaker. What we have said, that we have a fiscal envelope. If we want to go back to the table, teachers need to be able to prepare to bring savings that we're prepared to share back with them. But the fiscal envelope, Mr. Speaker, that is being distributed across the entire public sector has been clearly laid out to them, and that's the position of the government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, every other government in this province's history has taken their fiscal envelope to the table and worked it out with teachers. This government actually has it easier than other governments because the teachers have said their number one issue is classroom conditions. The teachers wanted to bring all this to the table with an independent mediator. They said yes. The Premier said no. It's as simple as that, Mr. Speaker. Parents want a settlement. Students want a settlement. Teachers want a settlement. Only the Premier, Mr. Speaker, because he's not listening to any of them. So why has he turned his back on the parents and students of the province that want to see a mediated settlement?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. It gives me an opportunity to remind him and all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, that we came to two tentative agreements with two different executives of Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Mr. Speaker. We've continued to invest over the last 3 years in the classrooms. We've clearly heard from teachers that there needed to be changes in the classroom. The Minister made an announcement yesterday. We're looking forward to the meeting tomorrow to work with the NSTU, school boards across the province to continue to respond to the challenges in the classroom, which I might add, Mr. Speaker, have built up over decades in this province and have been ignored by decades by governments of all political stripes, Mr. Speaker. We've made a commitment to respond to the classrooms. I'm looking forward to the outcomes of the meetings tomorrow and the ongoing conversation that will happen with our partners in education. But I want to tell Mr. Speaker, we've been clear from the very beginning. We have a fiscal envelope when it comes to wage and long-term service benefits. It's across the entire public sector, Mr. Speaker. We've committed to that. Nova Scotians have responded positively to that, and what we have said, we're prepared to go back to the table if they can find savings, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask a question to the Minister of Labour. In her statement today, she said, and I quote, "I've considered the information available, and I don't believe an external mediator could assist in resolving this dispute at this time." Well, Mr. Speaker, teachers asked for a mediated settlement. They were prepared to submit everything to an independent mediator, Mr. Speaker, but it is the government that has not done so. The Minister is required to be independent. She is required to assess the information from both sides when she makes her decision. Well, Mr. Speaker, what information did the Minister use to come to this conclusion, and will she table it in the House today?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member well knows, this is a confidential process. I take my role as Labour Minister seriously, even if the folks on the other side of the House do not. That means, Mr. Speaker, that I cannot share what my Labour team is told by. What my Labour team is told by people in confidence. What I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that this was a very important decision to make for Nova Scotians. I took it very seriously, and should the circumstances change, I'm prepared to revisit it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, to be perfectly honest, that minister has failed the parents and teachers of Nova Scotia today who wanted to see a mediated settlement, and she won't even tell them why. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Speaker. Her independence is under question here. It is very obvious that she's not on the agenda of the parents and students or the teachers. She is following the bidding of the Premier of Nova Scotia. She is not being independent, Mr. Speaker. She is putting the interest of the Liberal Party ahead of our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. And if she doesn't see it, then she should not be the Minister of Labour when a classroom year is on the line, Mr. Speaker. So I will ask the Minister, how can parents and students trust her now to do her job when obviously she is not interested in even trying a mediated settlement?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that previous to question period today, the Honourable Member called me a puppet outside this House. And on a day, Mr. Speaker, when women in this chamber, women around the world, Mr. Speaker, are feeling disenfranchised, defenseless, and very upset.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington will come to order. Order, please. Order.
Listen here, buddy.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington will come to order. If I have to speak again, I'll have to ask you to excuse yourself. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
As I indicated, on a day when all women around this world, all women in this House are so disappointed in misogynistic comments for a member on that side of the House to call me a puppet when what I did was my job. I took it seriously, and I have never spoken to him about that.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's great to see people are paying attention here today. Mr. Speaker, my question today, if I can get it through, thank you, is for the Premier in his capacity as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. Earlier this year, the Sibinigadig Band appealed to the Department of Environment's approval of the Alton Gas project. They appealed it. The Environment Minister upheld that decision, and a further appeal was lodged with the court soon after. In a written legal brief dated July 29, 2016, government lawyers told the court that because the band submitted its sovereignty in 1760, the government does not have a constitutional duty to consult them, and rather they say the province only has a duty to consult unconquered peoples. I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question today for the Premier is, does the Premier agree with his government's written legal brief that Nova Scotia is exempt from the duty to consult our First Nations people, and does he identify the Sibinigadig Band as a conquered peoples?
I'd like to remind the Honourable Member that it's unparliamentary to ask the Minister's opinion on a legal matter, so I'm going to disallow the question. Do you have a supplementary?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The policy and guidelines for consultation with the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, unveiled just last year, actually states that this province recognizes a 2004 Supreme Court of Canada ruling that each province has a duty to consult with Indigenous peoples and accommodate their interests. And I'll table that as well, Mr. Speaker. The Crown's current position completely contradicts this policy, insinuating that the term conquered to describe a band that has been victimized throughout their colonial experience and to argue their voices do not need to be heard is incredibly disrespectful, Mr. Speaker. So my question today for the Premier is, why was this position considered acceptable in the first place?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to comment on what was put in by someone else. I can tell you, as Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs, I've taken this issue of duty to consult Mr. Seekers very seriously. The very project she was talking about had gone through a process in 2007 and 8. Mr. Speaker, no activity had happened. All of a sudden, activity had began. They believed there had been a duty to consult. We halted that project, Mr. Speaker, to go through the process because it was important to us to make sure that the duty to consult was actually done in this province, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, sometimes that doesn't always mean that all parties agree. But the duty to consult, we believe, was fulfilled in this obligation, and we take it very seriously that the First Nations in this province, the Mi'kmaq, the people whose land we are on, Mr. Speaker, have part and process as we go through any development in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, Kenzie Donnelly, the 17-year-old leader of Students for Teachers, was here to listen to the Premier respond to her concerns. She came here again a couple days later at the invitation of Derek Hawes, who is the partner of the Liberal caucus manager and presumptive Liberal candidate, and he indicated to her that he represented caucus. However, she did not agree with the answers she heard in question period and said so on Facebook. The response from Mr. Hawes was to berate Kenzie online, not once but repeatedly, when she supported comments in support of teachers by the PC candidate in Dartmouth East, Mr. Tim Hallman. What is the Premier's response to Mr. Hawes, an adult man, claiming to be closely connected with the Education Minister, the Premier and Cabinet, was berating a 17-year-old young woman for no reason other than she decided that she disagreed with the government position?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know about the particular conversation that the Honourable Member is referring to. I believe if you look at what happens online, Mr. Speaker, across this province, there's activity, Mr. Speaker, that I believe no one should be interacting with. There's activities from members of this House that I believe nobody should be interacting with, Mr. Speaker. But I don't know the context related to what was there. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, he was not representing me. He was not defending my position, Mr. Speaker. I hope the young lady who came here, I hope they have an opportunity to talk to her. I would encourage the Honourable Member to provide her an opportunity to come and speak to me. I'd be happy to talk to her directly. I take this position very important to be able to talk to young people, and I'd be more than happy to do that. But no one, Mr. Speaker, will represent my thoughts online, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I largely agree with what the Premier is saying, except hours after the public post, they escalated the next day to roughly 20 private messages to her over a period of hours, with Kenzie asking him to stop. This is an adult male boasting about discussions he was having about her with the Education Minister. Kenzie said she felt bullied by Mr. Hawes and this government just for speaking her views. She said Mr. Hawes also suggested to her that her teacher, the PC candidate Mr. Tim Hallman, was using her and his other students to further his own political ambitions. And let me tell you, I know Mr. Hallman is a decent and honourable person, and I doubt that to be true. Kenzie has been left feeling bullied by someone speaking who is claiming to speak for cabinet ministers and caucus. She is upset and has decided to come here today and go public because of how emotional this has been for her and her family over the past week. Mr. Speaker, it's wrong. Will the Premier stand in this place and apologize to Kenzie, who is with us today over this very serious issue?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if in any way anyone who she believed was representing me was in a back and forth in an appropriate way online with her, of course, Mr. Speaker, I would apologize. Because in no way is that, Mr. Speaker, how I behave myself when I talk to people across this province. Mr. Speaker, it would be inappropriate for me to do otherwise. I do. If Kenzie's here today, I encourage her, and I hope to have an opportunity to have a meeting with her. Mr. Speaker, no young person, no person in this province who wants to have a conversation online should become a victim of cyberbullying, Mr. Speaker. It's inappropriate, and it happens, Mr. Speaker. If you look across, when articles are put out back and forth, people are saying inappropriate things, Mr. Speaker, looking back and forth. Every member of this House has been called things, Mr. Speaker, that I don't think anyone wants to be called. My children read what people talk to me about online. It's completely inappropriate, and I hope through what we're learning here from Kenzie, how she's feeling, other people in this building, Mr. Speaker, might take to what they say online impacts other people than just the very person they're talking about.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Yesterday I tabled documents showing that on July 15, 2011, the Warden of Guysborough claimed 2 meals and 3 per diems, all for one day. Today I received an email from the CAO of Guysborough stating that in fact the expenses were incurred over a number of days, which I'll table. However, the July 2011 expense claim was in fact made for that one day, July 15th. It may have been an error. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister. Given that this new information indicates a serious discrepancy with the July 2011 expense claim, will this new information cause the Minister of Municipal Affairs to call for a forensic audit to clear up this situation?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member is aware, there is an ongoing investigation that's being conducted in Guysborough by the Ombudsman's Office. I think it's appropriate for all of us in this House to allow that process to undergo its due course. And as is the situation in Richmond when we received that independent report from the Ombudsman, there were a number of recommendations that were in that report for the department to consider. If there are recommendations or evidence that's presented in this report that we need to consider and act on, we of course will be there to do that.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. In fact, I was under the impression the Ombudsman was doing an audit in Richmond County and we were talking about Guysborough County. Mr. Speaker, the former warden has a right to have his name cleared up for any wrongdoing. A forensic audit would accomplish that. It would also lay to rest the concerns of the people of Guysborough County that their taxpayer dollars are being used appropriately. An audit was done in Richmond County. It can be done in Guysborough County. The Minister has the authority to call for an audit. My question for the Minister is this. Will he call for a forensic audit for Guysborough County simply for the benefit of the former warden, which would clear his name and lay this matter to rest?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If there is evidence that comes forward that suggests a forensic audit is needed, of course we will consider that, Mr. Speaker. But what I will not consider is to conduct forensic audits of municipalities to satisfy the political intentions and motivations of the opposition party, Mr. Speaker. I will not do that. I do not believe that is fair. What we need to do is focus on evidence as it's presented and act appropriately, Mr. Speaker. And in the meantime, we are working with municipalities across the province to modernize and standardize expense accounting from one end of this province to the other. We want our municipalities to all have their expenses online so we can have a system in place that makes sure Nova Scotians can have full confidence, Mr. Speaker, in taxpayers' dollars that are being expensed.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Are they political intentions or are they the voices of taxpayers? Mr. Speaker, we know there were spending irregularities in Guysborough. My colleague tabled evidence yesterday and more today. 2 sets of explanation provided by the same CAO for the same expenses. Now, the CAO was upset with information I tabled here yesterday with respect to himself. He said he was shocked and appalled, and he accused me of lying, which I know, Mr. Speaker, is unparliamentary. I will table that letter. Mr. Speaker, the CAO has been responsible for overseeing all of the expenses in Guysborough for many years. Would the Minister assist that CAO in clearing his name by calling for a multi-year forensic audit in Guysborough to see if the expenses he oversaw were appropriate?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
It's very interesting for members of the opposition to lay claims of misconduct by our municipal officials and then ask me to help those individuals clear their names, Mr. Speaker. Am I the only person that sees the irony of that in this situation? What is happening here is we have members of the opposition that are taking this opportunity for political gain. They are not allowing the independent authorities to conduct the investigations that they are undergoing, Mr. Speaker, and I think that is inappropriate. And I do think that member owes those folks an apology until there's evidence to suggest otherwise. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, what we do have control over as a province is the MGA, and we are modernizing that act to ensure that all expenses will be put online. That is the goal we want to achieve, and to have a standardized level of expense accounting from one end of the province to the other.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, it's hard to take that answer seriously. Would the Minister suggest that's what happened in Richmond? Nothing to see here is what they were saying in Richmond, Mr. Speaker. We know the CAO was so involved there that he has since resigned, and the RCMP are investigating. Will the Minister take the word of the CAO and former warden of Guysborough like he did in Richmond, and fail taxpayers like he did in Richmond?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the member presents an account of events that are not accurate and that simply reflect what he wants to believe in the situation. Here's what happened in Richmond County. There was an annual audit that is mandated by the province that had red flags. That led to action by the Department of Municipal Affairs. It led to a forensic audit. It led to an ombudsman's investigation and an RCMP investigation, Mr. Speaker. That process seems to have worked fine in undercovering some of the problems that we have there. Why won't that member allow that same process to be undergone in other municipalities, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Last year, the Minister introduced amendments to the Children and Family Services Act. At the Law Amendments Committee, social workers, legal aid lawyers, members of the First Nations and African Nova Scotian communities all expressed significant concerns with this legislation. The bill was sent back to the department several times due to serious flaws and the lack of consultation, but it passed in December 2015. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is the government has said the legislation would be proclaimed in the fall of 2016. Can the minister provide an update on the timeline for proclamation?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the honourable member for the question. I was proud of the process of the Child and Family Services Act last fall, where it was introduced in one session, set aside so that we could further go out into the community and meet with our stakeholders. We met with over 30 groups and ended up with over 100 amendments, including 25 that were specific to the Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia, which is unprecedented in the Child and Family Services Act. It will be proclaimed, that act will be proclaimed in the coming weeks. I'm proud to say that. It took us this long to really develop the regulations and the standards that go along with the act, and I look forward to its proclamation in the coming weeks.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I voted against this bill because the changes unfairly impact families living in poverty, families of African and Indigenous descent, women leaving violent relationships, and those who have been in contact with child welfare services in the past. I voted against Bill 112 because it gives total discretionary power to community services workers and agencies while reducing the powers of impartial judges. And I provided the minister with a case from the Court of Appeal in Newfoundland that struck down a very clause that we have in that bill. Now, I'm sure that the Premier is not going to want to open his fiscal envelope to fight needless court battles in the courtroom, Mr. Speaker. So I'm asking, how does the minister plan to address these important concerns?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. And one of the major aims of the goal that was neglected to be mentioned by the member across the aisle is the protection of children in Nova Scotia, vulnerable children. And we have opened the fiscal envelope for this act. We have invested $1.2 million in new programs. We have more than doubled the parenting journeys in Nova Scotia, including tailored to the African Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq, and the Acadian. So we have made investments so that we are not reacting to child protection. We are trying to be proactive in keeping families together.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Business. Time after time we hear members opposite stand up and talk about how wonderful the economy is doing here in Nova Scotia, but the reality is, according to Statistics Canada, that since last month alone, Nova Scotia has lost 2,500 full-time jobs. Too many Nova Scotians have been facing job losses. Nova Scotians want to move home here and make a life for themselves, but there are no jobs. And you can talk in this house all you want, but you can't convince somebody that they have a job when they don't, which is what this government is constantly trying to do. So I'd ask the minister today, what talking points can the minister share with those Nova Scotians that are looking for work about all the wonderful, ineffective things he is doing?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to stand and speak to the work that's being done. Significant investments, Mr. Speaker, have been made in growing the economy in Nova Scotia. But as that member wouldn't know, before you build a house, you have to put a foundation in, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we're doing. We've made investments, Mr. Speaker, in post-secondary and our school systems. We've made investments in immigration, Mr. Speaker. We've made investments in infrastructure and innovation, Mr. Speaker. We've made investments in venture capital and startups. The list goes on and on and on, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess peering out from the top of an office tower in Halifax, you wouldn't know that before you build a house, you actually need a job. And what we have in Nova Scotia is 4,200 fewer jobs since this government has taken office. 4,200 fewer jobs. And last week I asked the minister what was happening with the buyer for DSDN. And at the prompting of the Premier, the minister implied we get web.com instead. Apparently that's his plan, Mr. Speaker. Nothing, no update on DSDN. Nobody knows what's going on with the buyer there. So I'd ask the minister again, what's the plan for DSDN? Does he actually have a plan to create jobs, or is he going to build homes that he can't pay for?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to recognize the member of Labour and Advanced Education. Through her public policy changes, over 2,000 students, graduate students, have found work in Nova Scotia since our government came to power. Mr. Speaker, 2.5 years ago when the Ivany Commission released the report, they identified population decline and economic decline as challenges this province has had to face. If we didn't, we were doomed for failure. Mr. Speaker, two and a half years later, Mr. Speaker, we see population stability and population growth. We see economic stability and we see economic growth. And that member can't see it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not just jobs that people in Nova Scotia don't have. They don't have doctors either. So my question is to the Minister of Health. People waiting for a doctor have been directed to call 811. This service was intended to help people receive medical advice to avoid the emergency department. Now people are looking for a doctor, are being referred to an American call center and receive a call back from an automated system. Now, I don't know how much this costs, but I know one thing, Mr. Speaker. We have a number of my constituents who have told me that it's not a waiting list that they need to be on, it's a doctor they need. So I want to know if this minister is going to live up to his government's promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian. When will he live up to the promise, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can tell the member opposite is that the 811 line is actually personed by five people who were hired to gather the information from Nova Scotians so that we would have a registry that would be up to date and inclusive of all those who in fact are looking for a doctor.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, people are tired of being put on lists. They already know that they need a doctor. They don't need a list to tell them that. Mr. Speaker, it was more than 3 years ago since this government promised a doctor for every Nova Scotian. And it is clear, Mr. Speaker, we're going in the opposite direction. Now the list has gotten so long and the situation is so dire that the government has outsourced finding a doctor while the Liberals are showing no sign of efforts to hire here. So, Mr. Speaker, I've had people tell me they have received calls from the U.S. answering their call to the 811 number. So why isn't a real person, a real individual, a Nova Scotian, talking to the people that need the doctors and calling them back and telling them how to get a family doctor that this government has promised them time and time and time?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. I thank him for his passion on this particular issue. And what I do know is that not just Nova Scotia, but all provinces have had enormous challenges with getting the right number of doctors in the right places. We will have much better information to target some of the areas through the 811 initiative. And what I can also update the member on is that after the Trump win last night, we've already had inquiries from doctors in the U.S. about relocating in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member, Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. An incident offshore earlier this year has raised concerns about the safety of Shell's ongoing deep-water drilling project. In rough waters, a massive string of steel pipes fell to the seabed mere meters away from the wellhead. A report following the incident noted that the senior crew combined level of skills were relatively low. Furthermore, the report noted that the available procedures did not address the risks, and I will table that, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, why was the operator allowed to operate with a low level of senior experience, and why were the necessary procedures required to address the skills not available?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would be well aware, our offshore is governed by the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board. We have a tremendously impeccable safety and environmental record here in Nova Scotia. Obviously, these matters are what the board would look at with their expertise in talking with Shell and talking with the owners of the vessel in carrying out any of the activities that they do carry out. And clearly, in this case, there was an unfortunate incident, but there's certainly lessons that have been learned from it. But as far as the enforcement and decisions being made on that side, that's under the jurisdiction of the Offshore Petroleum Board.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, CBC reported that these facts about the low level of senior experience and the lack of necessary procedures were contained in a preliminary version of Shell's incident report. However, it was noted that these key details were omitted from the final report. Mr. Speaker, if this is indeed true, there is an obvious question here, and the question is why. So I'd like to ask the Minister, why were these key details removed from the final version of Shell's incident report? And I know that the Minister actually visited that site.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first I hear of this. Again, these are decisions that are made by the Offshore Petroleum Board. I'd be more than happy to raise his concerns with the board in order to determine the response to the issue he has raised today.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you as the Minister of Health. We know people in Southwest, when they have a cancer diagnosis, if they need radiation therapy, that they do need to travel to Halifax in order to receive that. That means a lot of these individuals have to leave their families, spend an inordinate amount of time here in Halifax, whether at the lodge that gives or other facilities for them when they come here to Halifax. We know that in Yarmouth right now that at the regional hospital for our area, they're able to get chemotherapy, but they can't get the radiation therapy. So my question to the Minister is, what is his thoughts on actually getting a radiation therapy program going in Southwest Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and want to thank the member for raising an important question on the floor of the legislature today. This is an area that continues to be explored. The member for Yarmouth and I have had several discussions with radiologists and with the nuclear physicists who work in the radiation lab here in the city. We not only have team members that have great competencies, but also great compassion, and they were the ones who actually were promoting the concept of radiation for Yarmouth Regional, and we'll continue to explore.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the answer to that. I also appreciate the work that the member for Yarmouth is doing on this particular case as well. But we do need to understand that it's also important to all of Southwest Nova Scotia. I would say the people from Digby Clare, the people from Queen Shelburne, the people from Argyle Barrington, all of that area would be a catchment area for that kind of service. Maybe even Annapolis would find it better to drive down to Yarmouth than it would be to come here from Halifax. So I'm just wondering if the Minister has some costing available, because we know our foundation is ready to go to start fundraising for that one. What kind of cost goes on this, and is the Minister ready to go to his colleagues to find that kind of money?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There has been preliminary work carried out by the engineering team, I think in combination with TIR and the Department of Health and Wellness, and we will certainly have an opportunity to look at this, and he's absolutely right. It will be the foundation that would be a partner, and I'll have some information and work with both members here in terms of the future of radiation treatment at Yarmouth Regional.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was wanting to talk about mediation today and jobs and shortage of doctors and so on that is taking place. So perhaps with the guidance of my colleague from Colchester, Muscat, Abbott Valley, I'll ask the Minister of Health about dialysis. Several residents in Pictou County have been experiencing dialysis challenges. There is no question that the demand for this procedure will continue to grow. It is not unusual to meet patients from Pictou County requiring dialysis and having to commute to Truro. I'm aware that this is a challenge throughout the province. My question to the Minister, will the Minister give the residents of Pictou County an update with regard to improving dialysis services in Pictou County?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In terms of our dialysis program, we do have great information available, not just those who are currently receiving dialysis, but those that are in fact heading in that direction based on their current renal condition. And I know that there are a number of sites now that have had to go to a second I guess you would call it 2 or even 3 times a day, putting people through the current number of machines that are available. And I know one of those sites indeed is the Aberdeen.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has said on many occasions that dialysis service needs to be expanded, and the Department of Health and Wellness are looking at the provincial program. We are also aware that a number of regional hospitals are requesting a dialysis unit. My question to the Minister, considering the population base of Pictou County, therefore the increasing demand for more dialysis chairs, will the Minister commit today to informing Pictou County residents when they will no longer have to travel outside of their area to receive dialysis treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We certainly know the pressures of this life-saving procedure right across the province, and it's one that the department continues to monitor. And I know
time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, on a point of order, while things can get heated at times here in this House, I believe there's a level of decorum that is still expected of all members, and I find it ironic that we would have student representatives here to see the performance that was put on by certain members today. Mr. Speaker, during question period, the member for Argyll-Barrington could be heard repeatedly shouting at the Minister of Labour that she was a puppet. Mr. Speaker, as if that wasn't offensive enough, following the exchange of that question, the member for Inverness could clearly be heard saying if she was a man, she'd still be a puppet. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't think anyone would say that that is appropriate language to be used either in this House or anywhere else. It would appear that there's more than one reason to refer to the member from Inverness as Donald Trump. But, Mr. Speaker, on that basis, I would ask you